The ambulance bay at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like diesel exhaust and ozone, that sharp metallic tang that hangs in the air after electricity has done violent work. Rachel Torres stood motionless under the fluorescent lights at 2:47 a.m., her scrub still wet with someone else's blood, watching the EMTs back away from the stretcher like they'd just witnessed something that violated the quiet rules of their shift. The patient had arrived choking. Not gasping. Choking. Full airway obstruction, foreign body lodged so deep in the epiglottis that the crash team was still 3 minutes out, and every second was a second closer to cardiac arrest. The paramedics had radioed ahead. Nothing coming through. O2 sat dropping like a stone. 94, 89. 82, the patient's face had already started to purple, that specific shade of hypoxia that told her his brain was beginning to die. Rachel had moved. The scalpel came from the crash cart. Not the fancy equipment. The ballpoint pen came from her scrub pocket, the one she'd absently picked up after charting in room 312. Her hands found the cricothyroid membrane without hesitation, that small gap between cartilage rings where air could flow if you knew exactly where to push. One incision. Precise. The kind of precise that only came from muscle memory, from years of doing this when the only light was moonlight and the only sound was small arms fire echoing off the Sanjin Valley. She'd inserted the pen barrel. Rotated it. Secured it with gauze and tape from the emergency kit, her movements fluid as water running downhill. The patient's O2 sat climbed. 85, 91. 98, sinus rhythm on the monitor. Stable. The crash team had arrived at that moment, the doors bursting open with that specific energy of urgency, only to find a temp nurse with steady hands and the patient already breathing, already pink, already saved. Nobody had asked questions. Not yet. Rachel washed her hands at the sink nearest the ambulance bay, watching the blood swirl down the drain in pale pink spirals. Her knuckles had old scars, faint white lines that caught the light if you looked carefully, the kind of scars that only came from field medicine in places where hospitals were concepts rather than locations. She watched them disappear under soap and water, the muscle memory of the cricothyrotomy already filing itself away into the locked compartments of her brain where she kept everything else that mattered. Her locker was in the break room, tucked in the back corner where nobody thought to look. She opened it now, 3:22 a.m., the hospital settling into that deep false quiet that only happened in the hours before dawn. Inside, a ceramic mug with a faded Marine Corps emblem, the glaze cracked along one edge from being dropped in a motor pool shower in Kandahar. A dying succulent in a plastic cup, its leaves papery and thin but still somehow green, still somehow alive. And tucked in the back, folded into a precise triangle, a flag. She touched the flag without unfolding it. Not a ritual. Just a moment of contact, the way a pilot might touch the nose of an aircraft before a flight. She knew every thread in that folded fabric, knew exactly how many stitches held the colors together, knew the name stitched inside on paper that had yellowed to the color of old teeth. Hospital Chaplain, I Corps, Medical Support, 2019 to 2021. The flag had come home folded. She had come home and continued folding herself, smaller and smaller, until she fit inside a temp nursing position at a hospital in San Antonio where nobody knew her name was anything other than Rachel. She closed the locker. In the break room, the coffee maker hissed as she poured. Other nurses were here, 3 of them, sitting at the table with the kind of exhaustion that came from a 12-hour shift ending. They stopped talking when she walked in, which was normal. They always did. Rachel poured coffee with hands that never shook and moved to the corner with the window overlooking the parking lot, where the rain had started, not heavy, just a persistent spray that made the asphalt gleam like obsidian. One of the nurses, Patricia, who worked pediatrics, spoke into the resumed conversation. That was insane. That thing in the ambulance bay. Did you see what she did? 1 minute, 0 airway. Next minute, the patient's breathing like nothing happened. The other nurses exchanged glances. Rachel could feel it without looking, that specific discomfort that came when people realized competence existed in a form they hadn't expected to encounter. Competence that didn't announce itself. That didn't need credentials framed on a wall or a title that meant something to administrators. Where'd she even learn that? Another nurse asked. I heard she's temp. No permanent position. Just rotating through until they don't need her anymore. Rachel sipped her coffee. The mug was cold, like always. She never minded cold coffee. She'd learned to drink it cold in places where hot meant a target for snipers, where anything that created steam rose above cover and drew attention. She'd learned a lot of things in those years. How to move through spaces without being heard. How to read a room without looking at it. How to exist in a place while remaining absolutely invisible. Sergeant David Ochoa arrived at 4:15 a.m., brought by ambulance from the training facility at Fort Sam Houston, his left leg wrapped in compression bandaging after a compound tibial fracture sustained during a mock combat scenario gone wrong. Rachel was assigned to his room, room 347, third floor, post-surgical observation, though she didn't learn that until she was checking the monitor setup for his vital signs. She entered without announcing herself. That was her way. Quiet entry, efficient movement, the kind of presence that made people feel calm rather than invaded. His eyes were open, alert, the specific alertness of a young soldier who'd learned to stay conscious through pain. She began checking the monitors, her fingers moving with practiced precision, her voice dropping to the neutral tone she used for all patients. Vitals look good. Pain level. She didn't look at his face. Not yet. She was adjusting the blood pressure cuff when she felt it, the weight of his stare, the specific intensity of someone looking at her like she existed in a memory rather than a room. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Rachel's jaw tightened. Just barely. The kind of tightening that nobody would see unless they were looking for it. She turned to face him, and when their eyes met, it lasted exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she saw the moment recognition tried to surface in his brain, that moment when past and present collide and the mind scrambles to reconcile the impossible. 20 years. He'd been 8 years old in Sanjin, small enough that she could carry him with one arm while keeping her rifle ready with the other, small enough that his fear had been something she could move through a collapsed school building. He'd been an Afghan boy with dust in his hair and something broken in his left leg from the debris. She'd applied a field splint using cardboard from a meals ready-to-eat box and medical tape, and she'd carried him across 400 meters of open ground with rounds kicking up dust around them, her body between him and the fire. He wasn't 8 anymore. He was a soldier. He was in her hospital. And his eyes were asking her a question she couldn't answer. Rachel marked his chart without expression. Rest. I'll check on you in an hour. She left the room before he could speak, her movements controlled, her breathing steady. But her hands, her steady, reliable hands, stayed steady. That was the thing about years of training, years of combat, years of learning to exist in places where emotion was a liability. The hands never betrayed you. The hands only remembered what they'd been taught, and what they'd been taught was precision. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived for morning rounds at 6 a.m. sharp, moving through Oak Creek Memorial like a man who'd memorized every corner of it and considered that knowledge a form of ownership. His white coat was pressed with perfect creases, his credentials visible on his badge, his voice carrying the specific weight of someone who'd never questioned his right to take up space in a room. He read the ambulance bay report in the hallway, his expression shifting gradually from routine attention to something colder, something calculating. Rachel saw it happen when she passed him with a chart for another patient. She didn't stop. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply continued forward, her pace unchanged, her breath unchanged, the way a river moves past a stone without breaking rhythm. But she felt the moment something fundamental changed in how he looked at her. Caldwell's power was institutional. 12 years of building relationships with the hospital board, 3 former residents who'd moved to positions of influence, a brother-in-law who sat on the county medical review board. He'd never met a challenge to his authority that he couldn't contain, never encountered a nurse who commanded more respect than his credentials. And now there was this temp, this rotating nobody, and she'd performed a cricothyrotomy that his crash team was still being trained to execute. I'm going on break, Rachel thought, moving toward the stairs. The thought was dry, almost humorous, the way soldiers used humor to mark the boundaries between what happened and how you survived it. She needed coffee. She needed the corner of the break room. She needed the parking lot visible through the window and the rain still falling, persistent and indifferent to everything happening inside the hospital. Behind her, Caldwell was reading the report again, his jaw working, his fingers gripping the chart hard enough that his knuckles whitened. The conference room at Oak Creek Memorial smells like stale coffee and anxiety. 23 people sit around a laminate table at exactly 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, their charts and tablets arranged like place cards at a funeral. Dr. Caldwell stands at the head, holding Rachel's overnight report. The paper looks small in his hands, but his grip makes it look dangerous. "Ms. Torres," he begins, his voice smooth as oil spreading across water. "Since you took it upon yourself to perform an advanced airway procedure last night, perhaps you can educate us on the contraindications for emergency cricothyrotomy." Rachel meets his gaze. Her hands rest flat on the table. She doesn't blink. "Laryngeal fracture," she says, her voice level as a metronome. "Tracheal transection. Patient under age 12. Adequate oxygenation by other means." Caldwell's jaw tightens. He was expecting hesitation. Uncertainty. The pause that comes when someone is caught in something they don't understand. "And the anatomical landmarks," he continues, leaning forward slightly. "Cricothyroid membrane between thyroid and cricoid cartilage," Rachel answers without delay. "Approximately 9 millimeters high. 3 centimeters wide." A nurse 2 seats down shifts uncomfortably. Someone's pen clicks twice. Caldwell fires the next question. Then the next. Then 5 more in rapid succession, each one a trap baited with technical terminology designed to break her. Infection protocols. Complication rates. Alternative procedures. The statistical likelihood of permanent stenosis. The difference between emergency and elective technique. The contraindications for resuscitation tape versus sutures in field conditions. She answers every single one. Her hands never move. Her jaw doesn't tremble. Her voice carries no uncertainty, no apology, no "I think" or "maybe" for "if I'm remembering correctly." Just statements. Medical facts delivered with the precision of someone who has held these truths in her hands before, literally held them, the weight of a human airway in her palms while mortars fell 300 yards away. When she finishes the last answer, the conference room goes the kind of quiet that happens when everyone realizes they've been watching something they didn't expect to see. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Someone's chair creaks as they shift weight. Caldwell leans back slowly, his fingers whitening around his pen. His smile emerges like something hunting. "Impressive memorization for someone playing dress-up in scrubs," he says, his voice pitched low enough that only the closest staff members catch it clearly. The implication hangs in the air like smoke. Playing. Dress-up. Not a real nurse. An imposter. Someone who read a textbook and got lucky. The room doesn't move. Rachel's jaw clenches once. A single visible tightening of muscle, the only thing in her body that reacts to the insult. Then it releases. She nods slightly, as if acknowledging a memo about the break room schedule, and her expression flattens back to its default setting, professional, unmemorable, impossible to read. 2 nurses glance at each other. One of them, a trauma RN named Martinez who has worked with Rachel on 3 night shifts, looks at Caldwell with something sharp in her eyes, but she says nothing. Nobody says anything. That's the skill Caldwell has perfected. Making the room complicit in silence. The meeting continues for another 45 minutes. Rachel takes notes. She nods at the quarterly safety briefing. She doesn't speak again. 3 days later, she's exiting the ICU on the 4th floor when the elevator doors are already closing. She steps in and presses the button for the lobby, watching the floor numbers descend. Ground floor is approaching. 2 floors away. The elevator lurches to a stop on the 3rd floor. The doors slide open and Caldwell is there, his arm already extended, his palm flat against the opening mechanism. His body fills the frame like he's been waiting for this moment, timing it perfectly, and maybe he has. Maybe this is the kind of man who knows the ICU nurse schedule and positions himself in hallways before shifts change. "You know what I think, Torres," he says, leaning close enough that she can smell his cologne, something expensive that doesn't match the small cruelty of his voice. "I think you're a fraud who memorized some textbooks and got lucky. I think you're dangerous. And I think everyone here will see it soon enough." She stares past his shoulder. Her hands rest loose at her sides. Her breathing doesn't change. Not faster. Not slower. Not a single intake that could be mistaken for offense or hurt. 15 seconds pass. Her eyes don't move. They don't water. They don't look away and they don't look back. They simply exist in the space past him, focused on the hallway beyond, like the man in front of her is transparent. He smells the rejection in her refusal to react. It enrages him more than any argument would. At least an argument would give him a foothold. A mistake he could amplify. Something to work with. But this perfect, impossible composure gives him nothing. After 15 seconds, Caldwell steps back with a sound like disgust or defeat, and Rachel walks past him without a word. Her pace doesn't quicken. Her shoulders don't tense. She walks the same way she walks every day, as if the elevator has simply restarted and she's moving through her life with the same inevitability as the floor numbers changing. The next morning, she opens her locker at 6:47 a.m., before the ward gets busy, before anyone is around to see. The inside is spray-painted. Fake nurse in red letters, dripping and wet, the chemicals smell sharp enough to burn her nostrils. Someone took their time with it. The letters are nearly 2 inches tall. The paint runs in careful rivulets, like they wanted it to look violent, wanted it to look personal, wanted her to know that someone had stood at her locker for a deliberate amount of time, shaking the can, applying the accusation in thick arcs. She stands motionless for 30 seconds. Not frozen. Not shocked. Just still, the way someone stands when they're processing data. Then she closes the locker door and walks to the supply office on the basement level. The fluorescent lights flicker down there. The paint on the walls is institutional beige, the color of places nobody wants to remember. She finds Form 28B on the metal desk and fills it out in black pen. Name. ID number. Locker assignment. Reason for reassignment. Her handwriting is perfectly steady. She returns the form to the administrative box and walks back upstairs to start her shift. She doesn't mention the locker to anyone. Doesn't report it. Doesn't treat it as something that happened to her. It's a locker that needs replacing. Supply forms exist for this reason. The system handles it. The system always handles it. But that night, parked in her car in the far corner of the Oak Creek lot, with the rain hammering the windshield and the parking lights reflecting off the wet asphalt, Rachel sits alone with her hands gripped around something small and cloth. The flag is folded in the perfect military triangle. Blue over white over red, corners aligned with geometric precision. A flag that covered the casket of Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb, a unit medic, the man who taught her how to apply a tourniquet with one hand while moving under fire, who died in Sanjin 8 years ago with 247 days left on his deployment. Her breath shakes once. Just once. A single inhale that cracks slightly at the edges, the first sound she's made all day that isn't work, isn't professional, isn't part of the performance. Then she locks it away again. Her hands grip the steering wheel. The rain continues. Somewhere in the hospital behind her, patients are being monitored by doctors who believe their own credentials matter more than competence. Caldwell is probably reviewing charts, planning his next escalation, thinking 3 moves ahead like he's playing chess instead of destroying a person. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was happening right now, in room 347, where Sergeant David Ochoa's calf was beginning to swell. The calf circumference had increased 4 centimeters in 2 hours. Rachel knew this because she'd been measuring it every 30 minutes, watching the swelling march up Sergeant Ochoa's leg like an invading army, watching the skin tighten and redden and blotch with the mottled purple of threatened tissue. The pain had started as a dull ache around 7 p.m. By 9, he was gripping the bed rail hard enough to turn his knuckles white. By 10, morphine wasn't touching it. She stood at the foot of his bed in room 347, reading the story his body was telling her. Compartment syndrome. She'd seen it once before in San Diego, watched a surgical resident catch it too late and lose the patient's foot to necrosis. The muscles swelling inside their fibrous compartment, pressure building like a clenched fist, cutting off blood flow, killing tissue one cell at a time. 8 hours. That's all you got once the pressure exceeded 40 millimeters of mercury. I need to page Dr. Caldwell, Rachel said quietly. The charge nurse, Maria, looked up from her charting. He's not on call tonight. Dr. Everson's covering trauma. I need Dr. Caldwell. Or Everson. Or whoever's on. This is compartment syndrome. He needs fasciotomy. Maria frowned. Are you sure? He's only 4 hours post-op. The calf circumference is 17.5 centimeters and climbing. Pain out of proportion to the exam. Sensation changes in the foot. Rachel's voice didn't rise. It never did. We're looking at muscle death if we wait. Maria paged Dr. Everson twice. No answer. She tried Caldwell's personal line. Voicemail. By 10:47 p.m., Sergeant Ochoa's pain had evolved into something beyond morphine's reach, his leg a rigid, swelling mass of tissue in extremis, and Rachel stood in the trauma bay staring at the supply cart where the sterile scalpels sat in their tray-like instruments in a surgical kit from another life. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. Not in a sterile field with monitors and anesthesia and a surgical team backing her up. She'd done this in a collapsed school in Sanjin with incoming fire rattling the concrete and an 8-year-old boy's leg turning black from compartment syndrome caused by crush injuries, and she'd done it with a combat knife and hands that had to move fast because the dust-off was only minutes out and the alternative was amputation or sepsis or death. She picked up the phone again. Caldwell's line rang 4 times. His voicemail picked up. Dr. Caldwell, this is Rachel Torres from night shift. Sergeant Ochoa in room 347 is showing classic compartment syndrome signs. Calf circumference 17.5 centimeters, pain unresponsive to morphine, early sensory changes. He needs intervention within the next 2 to 4 hours or we lose the limb. Please call back immediately. She hung up. Then she waited. 30 seconds. Then a minute. Nothing. At 11:06 p.m., Sergeant Ochoa's toes turned from pink to mottled gray, and Rachel made a decision that most people would call a violation of protocol and that she understood as the only thing that wasn't a violation of every principle she'd ever learned about medicine. She walked to the crash cart. She opened the sterile field. She withdrew a size 10 surgical scalpel and held it up to the light, feeling the weight of it like an old friend, like the kind of muscle memory that didn't belong in San Antonio but that her hands remembered anyway. The fasciotomy took 11 minutes. 2 longitudinal incisions along the medial and lateral aspects of the calf, each one precise and deep enough to release the pressure without damaging the muscular and neurovascular structures beneath. She worked with Maria assisting, steady as surgical equipment, her breathing even, her hands the exact temperature of someone who'd never stopped being a trauma surgeon no matter what hospital ID she wore. The moment the scalpel breached the fascial layer, the pressure released, a hiss of air like breath she'd been holding for years, and the blood flow returned to the foot, the color blooming back into the toes like a flower opening in time-lapse. Sergeant Ochoa's eyes went wide. You? Sterile field, Rachel said quietly. Don't move. She closed the incisions with interrupted sutures, her fingers moving through patterns that belonged to another life, another uniform, another version of herself. The monitors beeped their approval. Oxygen saturation climbing. Heart rate stabilizing. Pain scores dropping from 9 to 3 before she even finished dressing the wounds. I'll call Dr. Caldwell, Maria whispered, her eyes moving between Ochoa's leg and Rachel's face like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. He needs to know. He needs to know his patient almost lost his leg because he wasn't reachable, Rachel said. But yes. Call him. By the time Dr. Caldwell arrived at midnight, Rachel had already cleaned the crash cart, documented the intervention in clinical language, and returned to post-surgical recovery where her actual assignment lay. She was checking vitals on a 42-year-old with routine abdominal surgery when she heard his voice in the hallway, loud enough to carry through the walls. "Where is she?" She didn't look up from the blood pressure cuff. The sound of his footsteps stopped at the edge of the recovery room. She felt his presence like a shift in air pressure, the way you feel a storm coming even when the sky's still clear. "I performed an emergency fasciotomy on Sergeant Ochoa," Rachel said, not turning around. "Compartment syndrome. 2 hours from necrosis. You weren't available." The silence that followed was thick enough to operate in. "You performed surgery," he said slowly. "A temp nurse. In my hospital. Without authorization. The patient's leg needed intervention. There are protocols, Miss Torres. Chain of command. You don't just..." He stepped closer. She finished taking the blood pressure, wrote the number down, and then turned to face him. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were flat as a winter sky. "What if you'd hit an artery? What if the fasciotomy was unnecessary? What if the alternative was amputation?" Her voice came out the same temperature as the sterile field she'd just worked in. "Or death. That's not your decision to make." Rachel held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked past him without responding, her badge catching the fluorescent light as she moved, her shoulders the exact width of someone who'd learned to move through difficult spaces a long time ago. Behind her, she heard him breathing hard, heard the sound of his fists clenching against the fabric of his pants. She'd just opened the medication cabinet when Maria found her. "He's going insane," Maria whispered. "I've never seen him like this." "Like what?" "Like you just made him irrelevant. Like you just proved that the procedures he wouldn't authorize could save lives." Rachel pulled out the 4 supplies with steady hands. "He'll handle it." She didn't know yet how right she was. She didn't know that within 18 hours, both Maria and the second-shift nurse who'd witnessed the fasciotomy would be reassigned. Maria to the pediatric ward, her expertise in trauma suddenly not needed. The other nurse to the medical surgical floor where critical patients never went. She didn't know that Caldwell had already met with the surgical chief, his voice calm and reasonable, mentioning liability concerns and credential verification in progress and patient safety protocols that must be maintained. She didn't know that he'd requested her employment file from HR, citing his role as surgical oversight, and was even now reading the 3-year blank space in her work history and the single line that said Federal Service, details classified upon request, his mind beginning to calculate angles. What she did know was that on her next shift, her access code no longer worked in 16 operating rooms. What she knew was that her medication request started getting flagged for secondary approval. What she knew was that she'd been reassigned from trauma to post-surgical recovery, from crisis to routine, from the kind of patients who needed her particular skills to the kind who needed anyone with a pulse and a stethoscope. She poured her coffee at 6 a.m. on the 3rd morning after the fasciotomy, standing alone in the staff lounge while 2 residents discussed the temp who thinks she's a surgeon, the rumor spreading through Oak Creek Memorial like infection through a wound. The coffee pot hissed as she filled her cup. She listened to their words the way she'd listened to gunfire once, as information, as data, as something that happened in the world but didn't require a response. Then she walked out, her hand steady around the warm cup, her face the exact expression of someone who'd already survived worse. Behind her, neither resident noticed the small folded flag pinned inside her jacket pocket, the fabric worn soft from 20 years of being carried, the only physical proof that Rachel Torres had once been someone else entirely. The office door was already open when Rachel arrived at 6 a.m. Dr. Caldwell sat behind his desk with a manila folder positioned precisely in front of him, its edges aligned with the desk's corner. He didn't look up when she entered. The fluorescent overhead light hummed its mechanical prayer. Ms. Torres, he said, finally meeting her eyes. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in violation of Section 12.4 of Hospital Protocol. A fasciotomy. Without surgical credentials. Without an attending physician present. Rachel stood across from his desk, her hands at her sides. The rain from last night still clung to her scrubs at the shoulders. She had the composure of someone who had already calculated every exit route from this room. The patient would have lost his leg, she said quietly. That's not your determination to make. Caldwell opened the folder with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment. He slid a single sheet across the desk. The termination letter. Her name already printed. The box already checked. You're a temp nurse, Ms. Torres. Not a surgeon. Not an authority on anything. He produced a pen from his desk drawer, a fountain pen, expensive, the kind that felt good in the hand. He set it on top of the letter. Sign here. The pen gleamed like a weapon. Like an offering. Like a test. Rachel picked it up. The weight was exactly what she expected. She signed her name in the space marked with an X, each letter controlled and precise, the same signature that had authorized medical decisions on 3 continents. When she finished, the ink was still wet. She set the pen down. Turned. Walked out. Behind her, Caldwell's face flickered with something between satisfaction and confusion, as if he had expected her to fight, to cry, to demand an explanation. Instead, she simply left his office while the hospital was still dark, before the morning shift arrived to witness her erasure. Before anyone could ask questions she couldn't answer without revealing that Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres was not a temp nurse playing at medicine but a trained trauma surgeon who had performed surgical interventions in Sanjin under sniper fire, in forward surgical teams with no electricity and contaminated water, in the kind of conditions where hesitation meant death. The silence of the hallway was complete. Fluorescent lights buzzed. The ER would fill with patients within the hour, car accidents and heart attacks and overdoses and small children with fevers. Someone else would be there to receive them. Someone qualified. Someone with nothing to hide. That evening, rain hammered the metal bench at the bus stop on Commerce Street, and Rachel sat perfectly still with a cardboard box balanced on her lap. The box was wet at the corners. Inside it, a Marine Corps mug with a hairline fracture running through the ceramic, the letters barely visible beneath the glaze. A succulent plant with brown-edged leaves, dying in the humidity. And a photograph, printed on the kind of photo paper they had used in 2003, showing 8 soldiers in combat fatigue standing in front of a FOB compound, one of them with his arm around her shoulder, laughing at something the photographer had said. Corpsman Jake Morrison. First name Jake. Age 23. Blood type O negative. Died in her arms in a building without a roof in Sanjin on August 14, 2003, his last words asking if the kids made it out. There had been 26 children. She had counted them each time she carried one to safety. 1, 2, 3, 4. The termination letter sat on top, already soaked through at the edges. The ink was bleeding, black words dissolving into water, the hospital letterhead becoming abstract, her termination status transforming into abstraction. Effective immediately. She didn't move to protect it. There was a kind of poetry in watching official documents dissolve, in watching bureaucracy wash away into the street. She had spent 3 years building an identity that could not be traced. A temp agency assignment. No permanent address. No social media. No photos. No digital footprint. Just Rachel Torres, RN, competent enough to keep patients alive but forgettable enough to disappear completely when the job ended. She had been wrong. A bus hissed past without stopping, the driver not even glancing at the woman sitting in the rain with a box. The rotor wash from a passing helicopter briefly scattered the rain sideways. She watched the water droplets fall again, steady and patient as bullets. The flag was in her jacket pocket, the folded flag from her unit ceremony, 20 years old, cloth worn soft from being carried. She had carried it through 3 years of running, through every shift at Oak Creek Memorial, through the moment she walked into room 347 and saw Sergeant Ochoa's face and knew that anonymity was a temporary luxury that only lasted until the people you had saved grew old enough to recognize you. Her breath came steady. Even. The kind of breathing that came from training, from practice, from understanding that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She held the photograph against her chest while rain mixed with something else on her face, tears, maybe, or just more rain. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. For the first time in 3 years, her composure didn't feel like strength. It felt like drowning slowly in plain sight. A man waited for the next bus under a plastic shelter 50 feet away. He checked his phone. He never looked at Rachel. The city moved around her, cars, pedestrians, the distant wail of an ambulance heading toward Oak Creek Memorial, where someone else was saving someone else's life, where her absence had already been forgotten by everyone except the one person she couldn't afford to be remembered by. In room 347, Sergeant David Ochoa lay in the hospital bed with his leg wrapped in compression bandages, the fasciotomy site healing cleanly, no infection, no complications. The surgery had worked perfectly. The night nurse, a woman named Jennifer, checked his vitals at 9 p.m. "Where's Rachel?" he asked. His voice was quiet. A voice practiced at asking questions in dangerous places. Jennifer hesitated. She had heard the rumors that Rachel had been fired, that she had violated protocol, that there was a formal investigation. She had also seen Rachel's hands and the absolute precision with which they moved, the kind of precision that came from somewhere deeper than a nursing degree. "She's no longer with the hospital," Jennifer finally said. Ochoa's expression shifted. The confusion left his face. Something harder moved into its place, the expression of someone who had just realized that the person who saved him had sacrificed something for the privilege. He turned his face toward the window, where rain streaked the glass, and he didn't speak for the rest of the night. But in the morning, when the sun came up red through the rain clouds, he asked Jennifer if she could help him locate Rachel Torres' address. He had remembered her face for 20 years. He would find her again. The rain at the bus stop continued. Rachel sat with the cardboard box and watched the ink on her termination letter dissolve into illegibility. There was a strange freedom in it, the official record of her employment washing away, the paperwork that proved her existence at Oak Creek Memorial becoming unreadable. By tomorrow, only digital copies would remain, and digital copies could be deleted. Digital copies could be lost in server migrations and IT department oversights. Digital copies could be made to disappear by people with access and motivation. She had been hiding so well. And now, sitting at a rain-soaked bus stop with a box containing the only physical proof of who she used to be, she understood that some people cannot be forgotten, no matter how thoroughly they try to disappear. Some people leave marks. Some people save lives. And some people, having done so, must accept that the people they saved will eventually come looking for them. The next bus came. She didn't board it. She sat and watched it pass, and then she sat some more while the rain fell and the city moved around her like she was a fixed point in space, immovable and already erased, a woman with nothing left to lose because she had already lost everything except the ability to keep breathing in straight lines and process information without emotional inflation. Lightning flickered over the city. Thunder followed. The kind of storm that made you understand why ancient people had been afraid of the sky. The San Antonio News Live studio was bright, too bright, the kind of overhead lighting that made everything feel sterile and performative. Dr. Caldwell sat in the guest chair at 4 p.m., his suit perfectly pressed, his tie a shade of navy that probably cost more than most nurses made in a week. The host, Marcus Webb, leaned forward with that particular intensity of local broadcast journalism, hungry but not quite predatory. "Not yet. Dr. Caldwell, you've worked at Oak Creek Memorial for 14 years. Your credentials are impressive. But you've come forward today with serious concerns about protocol violations and patient safety. Walk us through what happened." Caldwell's voice was smooth, calibrated. "Marcus, I don't take this lightly. I've spent my entire career upholding the highest standards of medical ethics. 3 weeks ago, An unqualified temporary staff member, someone filling in without proper credentialing, performed a surgical procedure without authorization. A fasciotomy. Emergency leg compartment surgery. This isn't a band-aid situation. This is the kind of intervention that requires board certification, peer review, hospital authorization. When I discovered this breach, I had no choice but to terminate her immediately. The words hung in the air like a perfectly constructed argument. The host nodded, making notes. Do you have concerns this wasn't an isolated incident? I have concerns about the entire culture of allowing rotating, temporary staff to make critical decisions that permanent physicians cannot. Caldwell's jaw tightened slightly, the kind of controlled anger that played well on camera. Patient safety cannot be compromised by. The producer's voice crackled in the host's earpiece. His hand went to his ear. His eyes widened slightly, the kind of shift that meant something was happening off script. Marcus, we're getting a call. It's stand by. He looked directly at the camera, professional but clearly surprised. We have Admiral Patricia Vance on the line. Admiral, thank you for calling in. The voice that came through the speakers was calm, measured, the kind of tone that came from someone who had given orders in rooms where lives hung in the balance. Thank you for having me. I'm calling because I need to ask Dr. Caldwell a question. Are you discussing Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres? The temperature in the studio shifted. Caldwell's face went the color of old newspaper. His hand moved to his tie, a small gesture, but enough. That's classified information. I don't see how that's relevant. It's relevant, Admiral Vance continued, because the woman you just described as unqualified performed that emergency fasciotomy under sniper fire in Sanjin, Afghanistan, in 2004. While she was a Navy combat medic. While people were actively trying to kill her. While she was holding together a 9-year-old boy who'd been pulled from a collapsed school with 2 legs broken in 5 places and a severed brachial artery. A pause. Long enough to feel like judgment. That boy, Dr. Caldwell, is now Sergeant David Ochoa. The patient whose leg she saved last week. Caldwell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Lieutenant Commander Torres has 2 Navy Crosses. A Silver Star. A Distinguished Service Medal. In classified briefs, we called her Nightingale because she had this particular gift, saving people no one else thought could be saved. She did it in Sanjin. She did it at Oak Creek Memorial. And you fired her for it. The studio lights buzzed. That small electric hum that only became audible in silence. At Oak Creek Memorial, the break room television played the broadcast on mute, captions scrolling across the screen. A nurse named Jennifer saw the word scroll past Lieutenant Commander and grabbed another nurse's arm. Within 45 seconds, every monitor in the hospital was carrying the feed. Doctors stopped mid-rounds. Orderlies stood frozen. The chaplain, Father Michael from the Catholic Social Services Office, who had served 3 tours as a combat chaplain, was already on his way to the broadcast studio. Marcus Webb's face had shifted into that particular expression of a journalist who understood something enormous was happening in real time. Admiral, can you tell us more about Lieutenant Commander Torres' service record? Bronze Star. Father Michael appeared on the split screen, his collar white against the dark studio. Earned in 2005 when she extracted 6 wounded Marines from a compound the Taliban had surrounded. She was the last one out. When the building collapsed, she was 30 meters away and still went back in. Silver Star. A voice from the Pentagon, a CIA liaison officer whose face was pixelated for security reasons. 2006, Operation Nightingale, that was the code name, when she infiltrated an underground medical facility being used by the insurgency and extracted 17 detainees, including 4 children. The operation lasted 14 hours. She didn't sleep for 36. The newsroom chat exploded. #Nightingale nurse was trending. People were pulling old classified photographs, heavily redacted but showing a woman in combat fatigues, her hand steady, her eyes like someone who had already seen the worst the world could offer and decided to stay anyway. 2 Navy Crosses. Admiral Vance's voice carried the weight of official record. 1 in 2007. 1 in 2008. Each one represents an action that saved multiple lives at the direct risk of her own. And then, 3 years ago, she disappeared from military service. No public record. No statement. Just gone. Until she turned up at Oak Creek Memorial as a temporary nursing staff member. Dr. Caldwell sat perfectly still. His hands were in his lap, but his knuckles had gone white. Marcus Webb turned to him directly. "Dr. Caldwell, do you have a response?" "I didn't know." Caldwell's voice was smaller now, the polish stripped away. "I didn't. There was no indication in her file that the personnel records didn't show." "Her records were classified," the CIA liaison said quietly. "She requested anonymity as part of her transition out of active service. That's her right. What you did, Dr. Caldwell, is you took that classified file you accessed improperly and used it to justify firing her. You weaponized her own security clearance against her." The chat was moving faster now. Screenshots of Caldwell's face going pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Screenshots of the Admiral's expression, sharp as a blade, disappointed in a way that seemed to cut deeper than anger. "Lieutenant Commander Torres risked her life for this country 14 times that we know of," Admiral Vance continued. "She was medically discharged due to service-connected PTSD. She deserved privacy. She deserved peace. Instead, she took a job at your hospital, and when she saved a patient's life, doing exactly what she'd spent a decade training to do, you fired her." Caldwell stood up. The host made a motion to keep him seated, but Caldwell was already gone, walking off the set like a man trying to escape his own shadow. Marcus turned to the remaining guests. "This is developing news. The Texas Medical Board is already reporting they've launched a formal investigation into Dr. Caldwell's conduct based on statements from 5 former residents describing systematic harassment and retaliation. Oak Creek Memorial's administration has issued a statement saying they take these allegations extremely seriously, and they're reviewing all of Dr. Caldwell's personnel files and patient interactions over the past 2 years. By midnight, the footage had 4.3 million views. #Nightingale Nurse was the #1 trending topic in the United States. The hospital's phone system crashed at 10:47 p.m. The parking lot filled with news vans by dawn. The board of directors convened at 8 p.m. in an emergency session that lasted exactly 48 minutes. At 8:15 p.m., the hospital's attorney hand-delivered a suspension notice to Dr. Caldwell's office. He wasn't there. His wife called at 9 p.m., her voice the temperature of January ice. "What have you done? What exactly have you done?" By morning, the San Antonio Express-News ran the front page, "Decorated war hero fired for saving patient, doctor's vendetta exposed." The article detailed every humiliation, every strategic move, every carefully constructed elimination. It included testimony from Jennifer in the break room about the elevator confrontation. It quoted 3 nurses about the spray-painted locker. Sergeant Ochoa gave an interview from his hospital bed, his voice steady and certain. 20 years ago, a Navy combat medic pulled me out of a building that was falling down around me while people were shooting at her. Last week, she saved my leg. And some doctor fired her because she made him feel small." The sentiment crystallized something in the public consciousness. By day 3, protesters gathered outside Oak Creek Memorial. Their signs read, "Fire the fake doctor and a Nightingale saved lives, who did you save?" The hospital board met again. The vote was unanimous. Rachel received the call on day 4. CEO Margaret Holloway, her voice formal but something underneath it, something like apology, something like respect. "Ms. Torres, we need to make this right. If you're willing to consider coming back. If you'd be willing to discuss a position. A real position. Something that reflects who you are." Rachel held the phone in her small apartment, staring at the folded flag on her table. The fabric was faded now, soft from being held so many times. She thought about Morrison, about Sergeant Ochoa, about the weight of secrets carried alone. She thought about her hands and what they were capable of. She thought about the choice between hiding and healing. "When?" she asked quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Meanwhile, the VA hospital system in El Paso posted a job opening for facilities maintenance staff. Dr. Caldwell submitted an application with shaking hands. It was accepted. He started 2 weeks later. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked into Oak Creek Memorial through the main entrance at 7 a.m. Not in scrubs. In a pressed blazer with a new badge reading a Director of Trauma Services. Staff members stopped what they were doing. Some shook her hand, tears in their eyes. Others simply nodded with the particular respect reserved for people who had survived what they shouldn't have survived. Her office was on the 4th floor, corner view, with her name on the door in brass letters. Inside, she'd arranged it simply, the cracked Marine Corps mug holding pens on the desk, the succulent, now thriving, bright green, on the windowsill, and in the center of a shadow box on the shelf behind her chair, the folded flag. Finally given the honor it deserved. Beside it, a photograph of Corman Morrison in a simple frame. At 9 a.m., she conducted her first department meeting. Her voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of someone who had made decisions that saved lives. The trauma team took notes. A surgeon who'd been practicing for 23 years found himself deferring to her because something in her bearing made it clear she'd earned that deference the hardest way possible. During a break, Sergeant Ochoa appeared in the doorway on crutches, cleared for release. He asked if they could speak privately. In her office, he sat across from her and said simply, "I've waited 20 years to say thank you. For Sanjin. For my leg. For everything." She met his eyes and allowed herself a small smile. "You don't have to call me anymore, David. And you already thanked me. You trusted me when it mattered." They shook hands. He left walking straighter despite the crutches. That afternoon, Rachel received a forwarded email, a photograph from El Paso VA showing Dr. Caldwell in maintenance coveralls mopping a hallway floor, his face exhausted and bitter, sent anonymously by someone who thought she'd want to see karma delivered. She deleted it without comment. At 6 p.m., she stood at her window watching the sun set over San Antonio, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something like peace. The work continued. The mission never really ended. But for the first time, she wasn't carrying it alone. Her hand touched the shadow box with the folded flag, the fabric soft and honored. Then she returned to her desk where a patient file waited, because there was always someone who needed saving, and Rachel Torres knew exactly how to save them. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, like this video, subscribe, and comment below. Who do you think deserves recognition for hidden strength? Let's remind each other that the quietest people in the room might just be carrying the heaviest burdens.